And hello everyone, it is Peter Sam, the Narrow Gauge Engine here, back again with another top 10 video. This time we'll be discussing the worst of the worst when it comes to the hit era, a 5-season stretch, although some consider it to be 4, that lasts from season 8 to season 12. Now this era is known for its overly child-friendly tone and repetitive messages, as well as favouring its main cast as the episode's main characters. So expect a lot of these to have Thomas as the main character. Minor characters like Salty, Mavis, Harvey don't really get a look in, and even then some of the main characters got butchered. This is all thanks to the hit era writer's bible made by Abby Grant, which just pisses all over what came before, turning Henry into a hypochondriac and making Toby and Edward essentially the same old timid stereotype. But how bad are these kinds of episodes? Well, let me tell you, they can be atrocious. Let's begin this list with number 10, as we always like to do. Number 10, The Man in the Hills. As much as the sets are very beautiful throughout, mostly everything else looks horrendous. There's a scene where Thomas meets Freddy in the evening and the lighting effects on them is completely wrong, making everything feel just a little uncomfortable. But that is a small critique compared to the massive complaint that I have with this one, and it's that the entire concept of this episode is dumb in more ways than one. A party for Mr. Percival is happening, and Thomas decides to try and find the Man in the Hills, some sort of mysterious, tall bloke in all white. He keeps mistaking other people for him though, but in the end discovers he's just a sketch on a hillside. I find this such lazy writing that it's just laughable. Instead of unveiling a real identity for this myth, we get a drawing. Amazing. Now don't get me wrong, I know stuff like this actually exists, but imagine being a little 4-year-old excited to see who this person is, only to realise you aren't going to see it. It's kind of a letdown. Also, this story makes Thomas seem incredibly stupid, which we know he isn't. He gives advice all the time and helps others when they're in need, and yet can't realise that a man in all white at a dairy isn't a dairyman, or that a man covered in white powder beside a mill isn't a miller. Even your target demographic isn't dim enough to think that. What are you doing? And even then, Thomas could have asked them before taking them all the way back to the wharf, wasting coal and water. Now you may be thinking that this is a terrible plot and that it can't get any worse, but trust me, it can. At the start of the episode, Sir Handel mentions he'll be telling a story about the Man in the Hills at the party, and he does in the end, to be fair, but we don't get to hear it. The narrator just says he starts telling the story and then it ends and the credits roll. If you ask me, this is the biggest crime of the episode, pretending there's lore to be had in an episode from a TV show which is lore galore and needs to be treated with a modicum of respect. It's almost like it's mocking it all. Yeah, this is not a good episode. It came from season 12, so what do you expect really? Number 9, You Can Do It Toby. The main problem I have with this episode is that it feels like a lot of regressing is happening here. As we're in season 8 with this one, the characters are being moulded into their new personalities, and this is the first Toby episode we get, meaning it's a bit of a jarring experience. He's now an old, timid box that is bullied because he's different, which is something we got past all the way back in season 1. That means the main antagonist of the episode, Gordon, also feels like he's regressed back a couple of seasons. We can praise him for all his character-defining moments in other episodes, but we also need to take note of where he loses progress and falls back into his old ways. As well as this, hearing the phrase, "You can do it, Toby," said over and over again by Thomas and Percy all the way through the fucking episode is irritating beyond belief, even if it is kinda sweet that they believe in him. One last little thing to mention that only affects the UK viewers is how weird it is that the voice Michael Angelis gives to Toby is just his James or Percy voice. Sometimes it sounds like a blend of both. It's odd to me because he's been voicing Toby for years now, so he should have a handle on the voice, and yet he doesn't. What a strange part of an overall strange episode. Number 8, Don't Be Silly Billy. This may be another one that gets me a few raised eyebrows. I know some people out there are expecting this to be right at the top, but I think there's far worse out there. That being said though, why a lot of people, and I'm assuming many of you, don't like this episode is due to the man himself, Billy. He's impatient, egotistical, and straight up ignorant. Then again, seeing it from Billy's point of view, he has an engine following him everywhere, telling him what to do, and that can feel like you have no control. Like Thomas, if Billy wants to pump his pistons before he's ready to move, just let him. There's nothing wrong with that really. Plus he has to deal with other engines and even Farmer McCall calling him Silly Billy, which can definitely come across as really belittling. Don't get me wrong, Billy is 100% an unlikable character who is heavily flawed and he does come off worse, but I don't think he's fully to blame for why this episode sucks so bad. Also, what was that comeuppance scene? I think we were all expecting Billy to get into an accident or at least have some sort of pain inflicted onto him, but no. Instead we get him running out of water. Whilst poetic, it is a bit underwhelming, isn't it? We spent so long rooting against him just for that to be the thing that changes him. Despite all of this negativity though, I did find the final scene rather sweet. It was nice to watch and I enjoyed watching the story come to a close in the way that it did. Yes, I know what you're thinking, and I too am surprised at how I managed to find a positive here, in amongst all this utter bollocks. Number 7, Thomas, Emily, and the Snowplow. I've said it before, I'll say it again, Thomas is absolutely treated unfairly in this episode because Emily refuses to see her place and decides to start controlling what she has no authority to. That is the main crux of why this episode sucks, and despite it being only one thing, it is a massive thing. Please don't clip that out of context. I realise my wording should have been better for that. Oops. Although, as much as Emily does suck, Thomas needs to realise that Emily telling him not to talk to school children and Emily telling him to put a snowplow on whilst it's winter are two completely different kinds of orders. The fact he doesn't is seriously perplexing to me. But don't get it twisted, I still firmly believe that Emily comes out worse. Not only is her desire to boss Thomas around unfounded, but she doesn't even really get punished at the end by the Fat Controller either. Now you may be asking yourself why I put this episode above Don't Be Silly Billy. After all, I have spoken about very similar things with both of these failures of episodes, and I've been very close to repeating myself on occasion. Well, to tell you the truth, analysing this episode felt way more like marriage counselling to me than the other one did, and it is absolutely painful. Anyway, let's move on from this train wreck of an episode and puff over to... Number 6, Duncan Drops a Clanger. There are a lot of hit error episodes out there that do something like this, where we see a character that's supposed to handle their train with care not do that for the sake of going fast. Duncan Drops a Clanger is one of them. Between the overused plot and the overused bell sound, this one is pretty annoying. However, I don't think it's as bad as I previously thought. Yes, it brings back the already completed rock and roll arc from season 4, and yes, the resolution feels super rushed, but there are some cool last sets. At least it looks good. It's still god-awful in my opinion, but I could probably watch it if I had it on mute. Also, here's a quick little oddity I found in the ending of this one that I can't explain, but maybe one of you guys can? At the end of this episode, Duncan arrives at the transfer yards, the drop-off point for the bell, but in the very next scene we see Duncan looking at the bell tower from a line directly beside it. So why did Duncan deliver the bell to the transfer yards there, and not here? It makes zero sense to me. Did I miss something with this? I don't know. Either way, it's fundamentally bad, but not the worst of the worst. You can't even do that right. Now let's talk about some honourable mentions. My favourite part of these videos, if I'm honest. A nice little break is always cherished by me, even if it is minutely better episodes than what we've just been speaking about. Let's start with a Season 9 episode, and I know the Ginger Engine cherishes this episode like it's his third born, but I can't do the same, mate, if I'm honest. I'm sorry, it's just shit. Saving Edward, as I previously said, tries to come across as about Edward, but he merely seems like a tool so that Thomas and Gordon can bump up their stat pads for the amount of episodes they've been in the season. In a season where Thomas takes centre stage a lot, and I'm talking like over half the season and has him in a leading role, can we not just let Edward handle one episode to himself without you fuckers jumping in on it? It just seems like the writers needed our number 2 to have a prominent role in an episode so they can tick a box, and in the process made an episode that turned into a different kind of number 2. Too Hot for Thomas isn't as bad as I thought it was anymore, but it's still pretty bad. It's boring with an overused plot about how all types of jobs are important, and even my nostalgia for it can't save it from being as terribly plain as it is. Even though it doesn't infuriate me, it still fails to entertain through its very by-the-book approach to the writing and narrative. It really is just the bare minimum, and the bare minimum gets you on videos like these. Finally, I'd like to talk about 2 Season 12 episodes which I find equally frustrating. Thomas Puts the Brakes On and HeHo Thomas. The first of these is awful because it leaves me with loads of unanswered questions about why specific types of bricks that are probably really expensive are used on this random bridge that we've never seen before. And why Thomas refuses help from his friends even though he is a danger to others. Those aspects make no sense and just leave me confused and infuriated. HeHo Thomas, on the other hand, just does the bare minimum, like Too Hot for Thomas. Also, Hank appears out of nowhere and is a mere stand-in for Percy and James in this very similar Thomas and the Circus type plot. Speaking of that episode, let's get to it now. Number 5, Thomas and the Circus. Despite the 2 very minor positive things I have to say on this one, it still ended up on this end of the list. That's due to its stale plot, nonsensical train of thought, and terrible ending. As you've probably realised by now, when a plot's been done to death, it has a higher chance of ending up on the list, and that is once again the case here. As well as this, we have episodes that don't make any logical sense whatsoever ending up on this list. Once again, checks that box. Why would Sir Topham Hatt assign Thomas to a job where he believes that the engine won't be able to pull it? He even says, if you think the train's too heavy, just ask for help. But then if you think that, why don't you just assign another engine to the train? It confuzzles me. Then at the end, we don't even get to see the circus performance in what is another common trend with these episodes. Give us some of that circus thrill, don't just palm us off with a moral and a final shot of Thomas watching everything. Show the audience. You did when Thomas was broken down too, which just makes this even more of a letdown. That being said, it has decent setup along with a cool fisheye lens tracking shot as Thomas puffs through Maron, and some nice music as the cherry on the cake, so I guess it's not all bad with this episode. Number 4, Thomas and the Lighthouse. Listen, I know I've gone on about pretty much the same problem with most of these, but this is yet another episode that does the awful trope of having a character ignore the warnings of going slow. However, because this is a season 11 episode, I feel as though I can be a little bit more critical because they've had 3 other seasons, 3 years trying to think up a unique plot and they couldn't. Everything is the same and it all feels way too overplayed, especially in regards to the narrative. The climax is abysmal with Thomas just running into a barrier, and whilst the ending's sweet enough, the rest of this episode was a drag and I'm not sure it was worth it. The sets too look more artificial here, and I'm not sure if that's due to the yellow filter, but for me, everything looked like a set in this episode and not something that could be mistaken as real. Now, if you'll remember from my season 11 ranking video, this episode tied with another episode for the worst spot of the season, so I'm sure some of you can guess what's coming up next. Number 3, Smoke and Mirrors. If you can't remember what this episode is, here's a quick summary based upon my notes. Do you remember the plot of Chickens to School? Well, it's similar to this episode, except the reason Thomas muddles everything up is due to his inflated ego, rather than his exhaustion. At least in that episode, Thomas can be seen to be at least somewhat sympathetic. Due to this being an episode involving a magician too, and this episode coming from the hit era, the ending is as awful and lacking in sense as you'd imagine, with the magician actually performing magic by turning Thomas into a present. This isn't explained or said to not be real, and considering we follow Thomas around for the entire episode, if he was in on it, he would have mentioned it, judging by the childlike quality of his character at this point. This probably means that we're meant to think that magic exists on Sodor, creating another blemish upon the idea of realism this show tries, or tried, to push forward. So this episode is just Tatma, but without the heartwarming music, comedic moments, or cool claw diesel. Literally the one and only thing that I wrote when making notes for this one, and what saved it from getting to the top was the fact that Elizabeth has a cameo in there. That must have been about, what, 10 seconds out of a 7-minute episode that I found gratifying? What a waste. Number 2, Henry gets it wrong. Wow, this one absolutely sucks, doesn't it? Not only is Henry's eco-warrior side not explored very well, it causes one of the most frustratingly stupid moves in all of Thomas and Friends history. Firstly, I get that it's 2008 and CGI was nowhere near perfect, but some of the animation, Percy's face as an example, looks horrendous. That, coupled with the fact that nobody questions why Henry's pulling 3 trains, as well as Henry just being a complete idiot and putting the oil tankers that go boom on the express line, just makes for such an unenjoyable watch. It's funny because putting those tankers there actually puts the wishing tree in more danger. If those catch fire, it's lights out for the entire forest. And this episode doesn't even have a good ending, because it's far too quick and Henry's realization at the end is so vapid. The Fat Controller says one thing to him and suddenly he's completely understood the error of his ways and feels bad for what he did. It just seems a bit forced for my liking. This episode sucks. But then again, what else would you expect from season 12? Number 1, Wharf and Peace. Upon closer inspection, I believe this is the worst episode of the hit era, and that is mostly down to one engine, Skarloey. Now, I know it's kind of hypocritical to defend Push Me Pull You and not this episode, but season 12 was very vapid and gave me barely anything. So I feel like we should let it slide because at least it gave me something. Let's get the obvious out the way. Skarloey should not be acting like a timid child, that is not his character, he should be more like Sir Handel. Let's swap those two around, please. This leads me on to how this episode just ignores everything previously established so it can do its own thing. The narrator tells us that Skarloey knows nobody's name at the wharf, which is nonsense, because he's the oldest engine around. Out of every engine that could have an issue like this, he would be the least likely, because this is his home turf. The railway's named after him, for fuck's sake. What's he doing carrying in the corner over there? Then we get salt rubbed in the wound after Skarloey becomes scared to talk to James. This is actually ridiculous. Now, you could argue that all of his character changing is just the writers trying to establish their own canon. But once again, I have to call bullshit. Because in the prior season, right, he's cocky, he's arrogant, he's a daredevil, he does shit. There's also the obvious minor issues like how the climax is a bit underwhelming and how annoying Skarloey's self-pitying is, but the main crux of why this episode is the worst from the entire hit era comes from how it fails to take consideration from previously established information in major ways, even in other seasons produced by HIT, and namely with Skarloey himself. As much as I defend Season 10 for being a better season than some give it credit for, I have to be honest, and honestly, I never want to watch this piece of shit again. So that was the top 10 worst Hit era episodes, and boy do I need a cleanse. Luckily, the next top 10 video will be discussing the classic series. Unfortunately, we'll still be discussing the worst, the shit ones. So until that time comes, I've been Peter Sam, you've been you, and I'm off to go give some more marriage counselling to Thomas and Emily. Bye-bye. No, Emily, you're not allowed. He's allowed to talk to kids, alright? They're interested, it's a train. You can fuck off with that Snowplow.